Born on the 30th of November, 1874, the British Empire went through an enormous amount of change over the course of the life of Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. Having served in some of the last wars of empire under Queen Victoria, he went on to shepherd his nation and the world in various roles through the terrible wars of the 20th century and on into the Cold War and the nuclear age. Towards the end of his life, he suffered at least 8 strokes, the last coming on January 10th, 1965. The man that was often referred to as the Old Lion passed away 2 weeks later. The death of a person that can only be described as one of the most important personalities of the 20th century is just one event that happened on this day, January 24th, in history. The planning for the state funeral of the Right Honorable Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, K.G.O.M.C.H., began in 1953, when on the 23rd of June, during his second term as Prime Minister, he suffered an acute stroke. Concerns for his health prompted the British government to begin plans for his state funeral under the apropos name, Operation Hope Not, directed by the United Kingdom's Earl Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk. Churchill, sometimes called the Old Pug, however, kept frustrating the plans for what was to be the grandest state funeral for a person outside the royal family since the Duke of Wellington. His personal physician, Lord Moran, struggled to get the Prime Minister to take care of himself, saying, "He is a poor listener, unless you agree with him." Yet the Prime Minister had fully recovered by November and continued to serve until retiring in 1955 at the age of 80. Operation Hope Not was fully prepared by 1958, yet Churchill refused to die, and the plans had to be constantly revised because, Lord Mountbatten complained, Churchill kept living, and the pallbearers kept dying. In their 2020 book, Winston Churchill's Illness, authors Alistair Vale and John Scatting argued that the former Prime Minister luckily suffered his last stroke on January 10th, 1965, although the event was not made public until January 15th. That day, he reportedly uttered his last words, saying to his son-in-law, Christopher Soames, "I am so bored with it all." After 9 more days in which he lay in a coma, Edmund Murray, Churchill's longtime bodyguard, wrote, "On a grey Sunday morning, that 24th of January, 1965, at 5 minutes past 8 o'clock, Sir Winston Churchill finally let go his hold on life." Elizabeth II wrote to his widow, "The whole country is the poorer by the loss of his many-sided genius, while the survival of this country and the sister nations of the Commonwealth, in the face of the greatest danger that has ever threatened them, will be a perpetual memorial to his leadership, his vision, and indomitable courage." One of the officers that Churchill met during his long military career was a man who had become famous for his defense of the South African town of Mafeking, besieged by Boers during the Second Anglo-Boer War. Besieged in the earliest days of the war in October 1899, the local military commander, Colonel Robert Benn Pal, had only a small force of locally trained troops and was not expected to hold long against a much larger Boer force. Benn Pal, however, managed a tenacious defense, which gained him great attention at home. Among those besieged in the town was Lady Sarah Wilson, Churchill's aunt. Mafeking held until relieved in May 1900. Benn Pal's defense made him a household name. Churchill, who had his own adventures and gained his own degree of fame in the conflict, interviewed Benn Pal for a newspaper after Mafeking had been relieved. He wrote, "In those days, BP's fame as a soldier eclipsed almost all popular reputations. The other BP, the British public, looked upon him as the outstanding hero of the war. Even those who disapproved of the war and derided the triumph of large organized armies over the Boer farmers could not help but cheer the long-spirited, tenacious defense of Mafeking by barely 800 men against a beleaguering force of 10 or 12 times their number." Churchill once described Benn Pal as one of the 3 most famous generals that he had ever known. While in South Africa, Benn Pal had learned many skills in military scouting and reconnaissance, much of it learned from American adventurer and the British Army's Chief of Scouts in South Africa, Frederick Russell Burnham. In 1899, he published a military training manual called Aids for Scouting. When he returned from the Second Boer War, Benn Pal found out that the manual on observation and deduction, designed for the military, had become popular with youth groups and even used in some British schools. He decided to write a version designed specifically for boys. Scouting for Boys by Robert Benn Pal was originally published in 1908 in 6 installments, each of approximately 70 pages and released every other week. The first installment was released on January 24th, 1908, a date which is traditionally considered to represent the beginning of the international scouting movement. Today's world organization of the Scout movement, which includes the Boy Scouts of America, includes over 50 million members. In his 1937 book, Great Contemporaries, Churchill wrote of Benn Pal's scouting movement, "It is difficult to exaggerate the moral and mental health which our nation has derived from this profound and simple conception." John Augustus Sutter immigrated from Switzerland to the Mexican province of Alta California in August of 1839. He was given a land grant of 11 leagues near the junction of the Sacramento and American rivers by the governor of the province, Juan Bautista Alvarado, to act as a sort of buffer state for more settled parts of the province. In his case to retain the land, which was taken before the United States Supreme Court in 1856, the reason for the grant was described: to guard the northern frontier and represent the government in affording security and protection to the inhabitants against the invasion of the Indians and marauding bands of hunters and trappers who occasionally visited the valley for plunder. Sutter called his colony New Helvetia, meaning New Switzerland. The area was occupied by U.S. troops in 1846 during the Mexican-American War and would be ceded to the United States in the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Before that treaty was finalized, Sutter decided to build a new sawmill and hired a carpenter from New Jersey to work on the new building, named James W. Marshall. By his own account, Marshall was looking at the channel below the mill and noticed something shiny. He recalled, "I picked up one or two pieces and examined them attentively, and having some general knowledge of minerals, I could not call to mind more than two which in any way resembled this: iron, very bright and brittle, and gold, bright yet malleable. I then tried it between two rocks and found that it could be beaten into a different shape, but not broken." What he had found, of course, was gold. It was January 24th, 1848, 9 days before the treaty that would make California part of the United States was finalized. In his 1966 book, Historic Spots in California, Hero Ranche opined, "It is no exaggeration to say that this chance discovery, by a man of no more than ordinary ability or fame, changed both the destiny of California and the whole course of American history as well." The discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill would spark a gold rush that brought more than 300,000 people to California, driving the development of industry and agriculture. The influx of gold invigorated the American economy, grew markets and industry from Chile to China. It would lead to statehood just 2 years later, and it sparked the eradication of most of the state's indigenous population in the so-called California Genocide. While there is a total solar eclipse somewhere on Earth about every 18 months, total solar eclipses only occur in the same spot about every 330 years or more in the Northern Hemisphere. Thus the excitement in New York on January 24, 1925. The website Curb New York explains, "Not only had it been 450 years since New York had seen a total eclipse, but the city was actually right in the path of totality. The track of the eclipse sliced through Manhattan and Queens. The path would cross the city such that only parts of the city to the north would see a total eclipse, while the south would see a partial one, the boundary being roughly between 96th and 97th Streets. The 1925 eclipse that hit New York served as a curiosity and civic event at a time when the media landscape was radically different. Decades before the constant flow of information and updates fed to us via smartphones, New Yorkers made sure that darkened sky would be a massive event," Kurt writes. Newspapers turned it into a spectacle, building excitement with banner headlines, while scientists in the pre-digital age spoke of the wonders of the miraculous event, testing new techniques to measure and track the astronomical anomaly. Owing to the public fascination, the scientific observation, and the path through one of the world's largest cities, the eclipse was, Scientific American asserted, the best observed eclipse in history. The observations included a film of the eclipse taken from the dirigible USS Los Angeles. The scientific observation was so thorough that David W. Todd, a professor emeritus of astronomy at the University of Amherst, told the New York Times that observations made during the eclipse helped astronomical science advance 1,000 years. But, Curb notes, another effect. But perhaps the greatest value taken from the eclipse was the shared public spectacle, the sense that, despite differences in everyday concerns, So many millions of New Yorkers simply paused in wonder at the same time. Mayor John Francis Hylan told a waiting crowd, "The sun may be eclipsed, but New York, never." In 1934, just after the end of Prohibition, the American Can Company was seeking a partner. The Brewery Collectibles Club of America, or BCCA, explains that American Can Company had engineered a workable beer can. All that was needed was a brewer willing to take the pioneering plunge. The Gottfried Kruger Brewing Company had been brewing beer since 1858, but when the American Can Company came to them, Smithsonian Magazine writes in 2013, Kruger executives were unconvinced. To prove the value, American Can Company offered to install the equipment, and Kruger would only have to pay for it if the experiment was a success. The BCCA continues. American installed a temporary canning line and delivered 2,000 Kruger's special beer cans, which were promptly filled with 3.2% Kruger beer, the highest alcohol content allowed at the time. The 2,000 cans of beer were given to faithful Kruger drinkers. 91% gave it a thumbs up, with 85% saying that it tasted more like draft than bottled beer. Reassured by the successful test, Kruger gave canning the green light, and history was made. Kruger first started selling cans of Kruger's Finest Beer and Kruger's Cream Ale to the public in Richmond, Virginia, on January 24th, 1935. A day, according to the BCCA, that is now recognized as the official birthday of the beer can. On January 24th, 1939, at 11:32 local time, an earthquake registering as extreme on the modified Mercalli intensity scale struck an area of some 40,000 square miles, with an epicenter underneath the city of Chillán in south-central Chile. The violent earthquake and its aftershocks leveled the entire city of Chillán, as well as some 95% of the homes in the city of Concepcion. Writing in a 2022 edition of the journal Latin American Research Review, Professor of Sociology Magdalena Gill of Pontifical Catholic University of Chile writes, "The great Chillán earthquake happened on the evening of Tuesday, January 24th, 1939. That hot summer night, about 150 people had gathered at the Teatro Municipal to see the evening screening of the American film Fit for a King. Around 11:35 p.m., the ground started to shake, something relatively common in the country. However, this time the movement was unusually abrupt and strong. According to witnesses, it felt like an epileptic shake, followed by a long death rattle. In the theater, some ran for the exit, while others stayed in their seats, but almost no one survived, as the roof and marquee of the building collapsed. In a matter of 3 minutes, Chillán became little more than a huge urban tomb. Estimates of casualties vary between 5,000 and 30,000, with Professor Gill writing, the most likely number is around 8,000 casualties, an impressive record for a population of barely 4.3 million. The earthquake was the deadliest in the history of a country relatively accustomed to earthquakes." In the early morning of January 24, 1961, a United States Air Force B-52G strategic bomber based at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, North Carolina, was making an emergency landing following a catastrophic fuel leak that caused it to lose 19 tons of fuel pressure in under 2 minutes. As the plane descended, it started to break apart. Reporter Carol Myers wrote in the magazine Our State in 2012. The crew levels the jet off at 10,000 feet with a technique called slow flight that checks to see if the plane has enough fuel to land. The right wing breaks loose. The pilot, Major Walter Scott Tulloch, ordered the crew to eject. 6 men bailed out, but Majors Eugene H. Richards and Technical Sergeant Francis R. Barnish were not able to escape the plane and died in the crash, while Major Eugene Shelton did not survive his parachute landing. The plane broke up in midair. Witnesses described the spinning aircraft as like a Roman candle and said that the explosion looked like daylight. Ominously, the plane was carrying 2 Mark 39 nuclear bombs, each with a potential yield of 3.8 megatons, roughly 500 times more powerful than the bomb that had been used on Hiroshima. In a terrifying twist, the force of the bombs being ejected from the aircraft had caused the safing pins on the arming rods to dislodge. Both bombs were essentially a single safety switch out of 5 from detonating. The parachute failed to open on one bomb, with bomb parts burying themselves so deeply, more than 180 feet in the mud, that they could not be recovered. The Air Force purchased an easement over the parts, which can still be seen today. January 24th, 1961, the day the nuclear bombs fell on North Carolina, resulted in changes to both the design of the Mark 39 bomb and the B-52 Stratofortress. Just a single date, this day in history, and yet I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of all the things that happened on January 24th that deserve to be remembered. On this date, January 24th, 1964, the U.S. 24th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting both Congress and the states from conditioning the right to vote in a federal election upon payment of a poll tax. On this date, January 24th, 1984, the revolutionary Apple Macintosh personal computer was introduced to the public. On this date, January 24th, 1989, serial killer Ted Bundy was executed by electrocution in Florida. On this date, January 24th, 2004, the NASA rover Opportunity landed on Mars. So much history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.